If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. You know yourself, but not the enemy. For every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. I know a quote by Sun Tzu is pretty tacky, but there is merit to what he says. I talked about using math to make logical decisions in deck building. Without an understanding of the metagame, it's hard to have that basis of knowledge to then draw logical conclusions from. I'm going to be talking about how I go about understanding the meta a bit and what I'm kind of looking for so that we can use the lesson we learned last time, find optimal ratios, optimal cards, optimal techs, and not just say it for some random reason, right? Because everything we want to do, we want to have an express logical reason for it. Before I continue, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below about any thoughts you have on this, anything I may have missed, and what topics you may want to see me cover next. I'm going to try to do these improving on YuGiOh videos once a month, or to try to take your game from the next step. And also, if you haven't, please go check out that first video I labeled Why How Do the Cards is Rubbish. Also, please go check out tsx1.com where you can use the code potato10 for 10% off on your sleeves. One of the biggest weaknesses among YuGiOh players is probably one of the most ironic. YuGiOh is often given the rep of being a game that's just combo memorization and that's it. When players do that, they'll reach a pretty low ceiling on how well they can actually do in a tournament. What happens when your opponent has any of the million disruptions like hand traps, or even you're just playing into a field? If you aren't able to adapt or don't have an idea of what you're doing ahead of time, it's going to be hard. And having a plan and being used to the situation is going to give you a way better shot at succeeding in these scenarios. And that requires going off the beaten path, not just the standard combos that I may show you guys, because at the end of the day, those combos are not going to be enough to do well at a tournament. You have to know what to do when something goes not as planned, which should happen pretty much every time. The game is not actually solitaire like people think it is. How do we prepare then? Well, truthfully, there's no cheat code. Everyone learns differently and a different amount of time required in different manners. You do have to put in time though. There isn't just watching a video for like 5 minutes and then you know everything about YuGiOh, because obviously if that was the case, then we'd have a lot more insane players. So you practice decks, you practice matchups, and you put in time, you study, you think, you watch a lot of duels. But there's a difference between just playing casually and playing with purpose. Now, I'm not saying you can't enjoy yourself. You will have to focus your mind on the game to try and analyze something. It's often like you were in school and you were given a book and you have to, after reading each chapter, go back and try and analyze your metaphors and all that nonsense. Look for characters showing hubris or the Wheel of Fortune, all the literary nonsense. And in a game, it's kind of similar. When the game concludes, you're going to go back and try to figure out what specifically turned the duel in your favor or you're against, and look for trends, look for patterns in games, stuff that if you had done something differently, could you have won? If you had played a different card that you could have searched, if your tech card was something else, is there a specific mechanic that you found yourself vulnerable against? Even if it didn't happen, if your opponent had it, could you have lost? And in the reverse situation, if you had it against your opponent, could you have won? Try to figure out the exact key moments and key cards in the duel, and then keep it in your mind so that you keep playing, you can find trends. And then you get a good understanding of how each deck and the meta kind of interacts with each other. You'll be better able to pick specific cards. Now, for some people, easier said than done. Through trial and error is the best way that I typically learn, which is bad because I'm pretty lazy with testing. And there are many events where I go in with just theory in the head. For me is a lot better than a lot of people, but it's still not enough for me to go all the way most of the time. The tournaments that I've done the best in, it's typically a combination of that theory, plus I've also practiced or played like another YCS beforehand or regionals beforehand to warm up to the format. And that trial and error made everything click to the exact amount. But for other people, it's playing other people for stakes, like playing for cards, playing locals, playing on DB, watching videos. Like some people will really learn from watching DB Grinder, and I can definitely understand how people are like that. Ironmans, which was probably the best way that I learned a couple years ago when I felt like I was in my prime. Or dueling with a testing partner. Again, this is similar to trial and error, right? Like most of this is just you actually dueling. A testing partner is probably what most pro players do the most because you don't have to put any stakes in the line, which is better. I'm not going to ever advocate for you to try waste money, though it is a resource or a technique that a lot of gamers have used in the past to try and entice a better duelist to play against you, and even if it costs a little bit at first, it'll get you up to speed more. Let me provide some examples of trends within like last few metas, and maybe that'll click for what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's take Kashtira in the current format. We want to find the breaking points of this deck so we know the best tech cards to beat Kashtira. And then also what cards to play in our Kashtira deck to then counter their tech cards that are countering us. You're looking for counters to counters to counters until eventually there's nowhere left to go. Or sometimes into a circle like you do with the Nibiru stuff, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, you're looking for counters pretty much based off of specific key weaknesses you can find. So a simple one with Kashtira is that you need an empty field to start playing. In practice, I found this is probably the best choke point to stop Kashtira. Really hard with most hands to play through it through your engine, and then even most utility cards don't do a great job of cleaning up your own field. Plunder Patrol Jord, which you can see here, Ibli, Kaiju's to an extent, and Book of Moons, turning something face down so it's now an unusable card that clogs the field, are all effective ways of stopping Kashtira. So yeah, and then understanding why these work efficiently helps us notice more obscure things on the fly so we can adapt our strategy to take advantage of this principle. So what I'm talking about is, say you're playing against Kashtira and they have a Zeus in the field, and the Zeus is dead, it has no materials. You'll be presented with an easy opportunity, you can attack over it. Or you have a Baron up. You can choose to pop the Zeus, or you could let it sit there. Why would you not just take the free card and pop the Zeus? We know for a fact that them clogging the field is actually a weakness point of the deck. So even though you'd be going +1, it'd be bad in the long run to just follow the strategy that you've maintained until this point. So yeah, keep up the Zeus, and then you can either put the Baron to the fence, or you tag it out in the standby phase. Pretty much don't let the Zeus leave the field, and then it'll make it way harder for them to play, and then you can go into your only kill the Zeus once you're like fully set up, and then you can control the game in a normal fashion. Or you can replace it with something else, say you're playing Plunder with the Jord token, however else you're planning to beat that deck. But yeah, it gives you time in a way that you may otherwise not had if you had just popped the Zeus. So okay, this is an obvious point in the format. I think we all understand that. However, just because a deck has a bunch of restrictions or conditions on it doesn't mean those things are always going to be the greatest things you can exploit to beat the deck. Let's wind back the clock about 8 years to the NAWCQ 2015. This is about Nekroz, Burning Abyss, and then some of the decks were like Cleave Fort. Let's focus on BA for a second here. Now, you're building your deck to beat all these decks, and you're focusing, one of the decks you're planning around is Burning Abyss right now. You're trying to get a side deck set up. What counter cards do you want? I think, okay, well, the Burning Abyss cards all have the restriction. If there is a non-Burning Abyss in the field, they die. So surely Flying Sea is a good card then. It stops XYZs, and it stops them from being able to keep Burning Abysses in the field. They all self-destruct immediately. Theoretically, that's a great counter, right? It's similar to against Cash. You're stopping them from maintaining a field. Let's take a look at what this Burning Abyss deck looked like. So this was the Burning Abyss deck that I played around that format. It may have been a little bit different, but this is pretty much what I had. While it may not be the exact same as what everyone else's was, it's pretty similar in concept, right? It's a lot of trap cards, and then you're floating with Dante Seer for resources. If you actually play against this deck a bunch of times, you'll start noticing that the way this deck beats you is through two main avenues, and that it's using its wide variety of defensive trap cards to keep you from really winning the game. And the second way is Dante Seer giving you infinite attrition, so it becomes incredibly hard to ever connect the direct attack against you, and then in the long game you will just lose all your life points to getting poked down by these. So what does Flying Sea address here? May be beneficial sometimes to stop the Dante from ever hitting the field. However, if you draw it at a later point because the game's expected to go long, or if they just have another way to clear it up, you end up still losing the game because they still have all the other ways they're beating you, right? They still get the Dante Seer, they still get all the trap cards. The best way of beating them then is to focus on attacking those specific key points that they used to win. So you can attack the graveyard using stuff like Karma Cuts, Fiend Griefings, like what's in the deck here in the main deck, to hit their Seer Dante loop, and that way you can succeed in the War of Attrition if you want to take that approach. Or you can try and shut off the defensive tools, because if you notice here, the BA cards don't have any in-engine disruption outside of the traps. Only disruption they could possibly put up is Engineer, detaching Farfur Alich, which were pretty high investment plays you only did when you had a really bad hand, or you just needed something else like to accompany what you had face down. So if you could then target the trap cards, stuff like Denko Sekka, Trap Stun, Royal Decree, those were better strategies typically. That's in line with looking for what's actually making you lose the game and what their actual strategy is and targeting that. So with Kashtira, the restriction of having a monster in the field is important because it's a very monster board heavy deck, and focusing on that restriction is helpful, but that's not always the case. That's why you actually want to duel and see if these conditions do lead to a trend. So if we go back to Kashtira here, what's another trend we may notice? So one of the biggest things when you're doing the Rise Heart Pass play is you're banishing a card off Rise Heart here and then hitting the top 3 of the deck. The card you banish is a card you can likely attach to your Rise Heart later on in the turn or on their turn. So you want to attach typically Big Bang or Theosis. Theosis gets follow-up, and Big Bang can be detached to summon back a Fenrir. Now, how do we know which one is better? Well, part of understanding your opponent's deck is one. If it's game 2 and you know they're playing a deck that is very aggressive, has a lot of combo cards, and could potentially push through just the Arise Heart without non-engine, you probably want Big Bang, because you can get the Fenrir out and it'll give you a little more to stop your opponent. If your opponent's deck is kind of a hard time as more of a control deck, and the Fenrir is not going to be a huge deal to them, then you get Theosis. But knowing that those matchups is integral to make that decision. If you don't know which matchup you want more disruption against, which you want more follow-up against, you may make the wrong decision in game. So that's where keeping an eye of trend on which matters more in each matchup is going to be important. So like if I play the Mirror and I have follow-up in hand, I'm probably putting the Big Bang under. That way, if they summon like a Fenrir, I can go banish it and then summon my own Fenrir back, and then I still have that disruption there. So it's a little harder for them to kind of clean up the field. And it also depends what you have in hand, right? Because in your hand, you have to decide, based on the cards I have, I've played out this scenario before, am I going to need more follow-up or am I going to need more disruption? So say this hand here, 2 Ash, 2 Prosperity, I'd probably say I have enough follow-up. Prosperity for next turn is plenty, and then I could hit another follow-up off Prosperity. I'd probably put Big Bang under, because I'm not guaranteed disruption cards. Prosperity may be the one that I Prosperity Ash, and that's probably fine. And then you can also have the option of Prosperity and putting a Garura under as well. As you play more, it can become like split decisions because you've been in this situation before. You picked up on the trend, you know how the game goes if you do one thing. So you can in like 2 seconds pick the right option. However, if you're not used to this type of scenario because you haven't put in the effort to practice trial and error and notice the patterns, you will spend time on nonsense, and you could also just make the wrong call. Let's talk about tier element for a second. In the old formats, or I guess even now, we're looking at breaking points at tiers. Now, at the beginning of the format, people didn't really have a good idea of what they wanted to use to stop tier elements, and there was people using all sorts of hand traps. When you start thinking about tiers, you realize that the deck can have like a ton of gas, but it is constrained by one thing. Its constraints are its effects are hard ones per turns. If they cycle through all their effects, if you give them full access to their deck, no matter how much more they mill, the limit to what they can do stops at some point. So if you rather negate the specific tier effects, and their total overall capacity for a board goes down. What I mean is, instead of trying to choke the deck with stuff like Ash, stuff like Toad stopping milling, you instead let them mill and then target the tiers and graves so that they can no longer fuse as many times. Beat them that way. Their fields will be less strong, and then you can also clean up the field with the guys on field, which is another trend, noticing the big dudes are kind of hard for tiers to deal with. So if they have 3 fusions per turn and you cut off one with a Bestial, there's only 2 fusions left. So one is always going for a kit, and now it's harder for them. They have to pick for Muddragon, Garura, and Rokalas, and all of which could be important. That's part of why Bestials ended up being like the main card to beat them. Now, it seems really obvious. Graveyard effect Bestials are good. That may have not been the case. There may have been a real world where the tiers weren't once per turn, and then milling a bunch of cards would have meant Bestials just weren't enough. You get completely overflown, and the best way to stop them is try and stop them from milling in the first place. Obviously, that's not the case, which is why we go this route, but still something that you'd want to consider into why it's good. If their counter strategy to us is always going to be to keep us off as many names as possible, what can we do to beat that? Well, that's why some people started considering King of the Swamp and Polymerization. And King of the Swamp is cool because it can be used for Kit Kalos or for the Graph of Dark Lord. What I really like about Polymerization is that you can fuse for Kit Kalos and you still have all 3 tier names left. And that's why Instant Fusion was so insane. Because now even if you had a Bestial, and if they had a Poly or an Instant Fusion, they still had 3 fusions left. So if you Bestial 1 now, 2 fusions left, I mean, that's still plenty to make their full field, and your Bestial is rather ineffective. Looking at these trends and understanding why cards were good lets you more effectively think of the counters. I decided that you could still play around the Bestials enough without the Poly for it to be worth it, and they weren't good enough going second, and there were other issues with the deck that Poly didn't address, which is why it didn't end up in my deck. However, that was the merit that it did have. So let's talk about another trend now with Chillments, and how do we break the fields going second? Because that was a thing that you could do, but you didn't understand what you were looking for. Okay, so say you're staying down this standard field from the Chillment opponent. So the main way that if you played this, you'd realize what you want to do to beat Chillments most of the time is Dweller into Zeus. This stops for follow-ups. It means all their guys sitting on the field won't do anything. It also cleans up everything they have. So they're not going to have a Scream on their turn. They're not going to have an Alpha on their turn. And it theoretically stabilizes the game. How do we get there? Well, it means you want to focus all your other resources that aren't putting 2/4s in the field and debating out the rest of the interrupts. So if you have other ways to deal with something and that doesn't involve making Zeus, that's what you'd want to burn and throw. So what I'm talking about here is like with Planet. If you can find a way to get the Planet to force an interrupt and then still having a way to Zeus afterwards, that's ideal. And it's very easy to do that typically because the Planet can shuffle back cards in grave, force a pop, force an interrupt, and then most of the time Planet needs to be addressed there. Planet's not integral to our end goal, so we don't mind mind it getting obliterated in the crossfire. They want to stop Zeus, Dweller Zeus, because they know it's coming. They can stop either or, that's probably good enough. The interruptions include the Shufflebacks, the Dweller's already activated, they got the Elf, they have another Merly Grave, they have Scream, and they have Sulik. So if they don't put this on the field, the Merly, then if you held a Bestial, which is very real, because sometimes one is not enough and you want to hold it, you don't have a guy on field, a tier, and which means Scream won't work, Sulik doesn't work, and if you go summon a guy, the Elf, you Bestial the Merly, they die. They lose on the spot. And that's one way of beating the deck. So they know that trend. They know that's a play that happens. They bring this Elf out. They bring out the Merly. They intentionally put a second Merly in the grave off of Rhinoheart to make sure this situation didn't come up. So the second you normal summon, they get 3 more mills and they play on your turn. With all these fusion effects, what can they make? They can make Kaleidoheart to spin off the field, and they can make Stapelia. So if they see level 4, they should probably go Kaleido hit the 4. If you can force out all the milling before you commit your 2 4s, then it means that they can't Stapelia you. They can't Kaleidoheart you. The best play is to Stapelia you. So if you can find a way to do that, to force out the milling so they can just Stapelia you, and then clean up or bait the Stapelia or put an Elf up for the Dweller so they can't Stapelia you there, then that's how you can win the game. I tried to show you a bit of my perspective on how I approach metagames and what I'm looking for. And this is something that's so hard for me to communicate and verbalize that I don't know if it got through properly. So please do let me know if you kind of follow along with what I was saying. I know it may have just sounded like what I said was practice and get better. I think it's just look for trends that keep happening so you can exploit them within deck building or in game. And I'm kind of showing you some of the ways I've done that in the past. But even then, if you don't fully understand it yourself, it'll impact your decision making sometimes in a skewed way. You'll focus on the wrong things, and that's not good. So just make sure that you understand it for yourself and not just copying other people, even if it will get you part of the way there. I will hopefully continue this series in the future, so let me know what topics you want me to cover on next. That's it for now. Peace.